My name's Fiona Murray. I am the Associate Dean of Innovation here at MIT Sloan. I've been on the faculty here for coming up on 20 years, which it feels like only yesterday when I came in 1999. I've been here ever since, and it's a tremendous privilege, as always, to reflect on being part of MIT Sloan and part of MIT, which is such an incredible institution. As I walked around campus today, I'm always reminded on this beautiful sunny day what it means to be part of this amazing community. When I joined the faculty, one of the people I met reasonably soon in my time here was Professor Lotte Bailyn. And so I'm really delighted to have the honor of introducing Lotte today. Lotte, although I did not know it at the time, was actually the first tenured woman faculty here at MIT Sloan School. Is that right? Tenure track faculty here at the Sloan School, which is, on the one hand, we might say, why did it take so long? But on the other hand, is an incredible accomplishment. And she really forged a path for all the rest of us. All junior faculty, frankly, looked to her for guidance and advice. And especially those of us as female faculty found her an incredible inspiration and somebody we could come and talk to and get advice from about how to really survive in a complicated world and also have that work-life, or perhaps work-life, personal life balance. And even in the few minutes that Lotte and I have had to speak to one another today, she's already given me a little bit more excellent advice and reminded me that I too have to think about that in my own career and how I think about my life. So she's always been an incredible fountain of wisdom in that regard. And she's also been tremendous in not only having those ideas as a human being and as an individual who's really thoughtful and enlightened, but actually taken her scholarship in that direction too. And I think has inspired those of us who've continued to work on issues around gender in the workplace as well. And some of her work, right, has been really about work-life and personal life balance. Some of it has been, she's put together in this extraordinary book, Breaking the Mold, Redesigning Work for Productive and Satisfying Lives. And in the wake of her own retirement, has started to sort of study in that kind of classic anthropologist, ethnographer sort of way, look inward and say, all right, I'm going through this transition. Let me actually not just experience it, but let me study it and let me shine a light on it. How are other people coping with this? And bringing a real sort of sense of understanding to that, and not just through storytelling and understanding, but also through data. As some of you may know, that MIT some time ago did this very path-breaking study when they looked at the role of women on the faculty and understood things and sort of translated it into MIT terms. How much lab bench space did women have relative to their male counterparts, right? We have to break it down into the currencies that matter in this organization, how many graduate students, how much funding, and so on. And it was really because of her study and that incredibly detailed, thorough approach that talked about this issue in language and in currency that MIT could understand, that the then President Chuck Vest could actually be incredibly forthright and publish that report, which opened up a whole series of conversations and transformations. And I think many of us have tried to follow in her footsteps in terms of bringing data to bear on understanding these really, really critical subjects. And so I'm really delighted that you all have a chance to have a conversation with her. In the interest of a little bit of work and life balance, I actually won't be staying for the remainder of lunch, which I'm very sorry about. But I know that you're in safe and incredibly fascinating intellectual hands. I know Lotte wants this to be as much a conversation as just a presentation. I have many questions, but I get a chance, I hope, to ask them on another occasion. But let me thank you, Lotte, for being here and welcome you back.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you, Fiona. And you talked about the MIT report, and the MIT Press is contemplating for the 20-year anniversary, which comes up next year. It came out in 1999, is contemplating both a book and a film to somehow tell that story, and that'll be interesting. So what I want to do briefly, because I really want to hear from all of you, is tell you about two research projects. And I'm going to get a glass of water. And one of them has to do with our action research projects in organizations. And a very different kind of research project is one I'm currently involved in, which deals with retirement. And I want to introduce our conversation by telling you a little bit about it. So first, the action research project. The problem that we were interested in was gender equity. Why were women not moving up in organizations? And we approached it in a somewhat different way. We knew, of course, about policies and practices that helped, and they were very important, but they didn't seem to be really helping get women up, easily up. We knew about efforts to help women by teaching them to be assertive or teaching them how to negotiate, and that didn't necessarily seem to help, though again can be important on an individual level. So our underlying approach is what I had called learning from diversity. I had used that in teaching, and I first wrote it up actually in the original 1993 edition of Breaking the Mold. And the idea behind it is that if you've got new kinds of people coming into the workforce, and they seem to be having troubles that your old homogeneous group didn't have, don't blame them. Don't try to change them, don't try to teach them, but look at what's going on in the organization, the procedures and the practices that were leading to their problems. And a very quick example, which I had nothing to do with, way back when AT&T got into trouble because they didn't get women into supervisory positions, New England Telephone was trying, they always had a very expensive but very good training program. They put their people through it, and they became good supervisors, their men. When they tried to put their women through it, they didn't become good supervisors. But because there was some legal pressure, they didn't say, women are no good at supervision. They called in a sociologist. And she wanted to find out what's going on with this training and what happens when people get on the workforce. And she discovered that it wasn't the training that was helping these men being such good supervisors. It was the fact that they were getting help from their peers. And so when they managed to arrange that women also got on-the-job training, they turned out to be okay as supervisors. And then they could, in fact, no longer have this expensive training, but changed it all. So that's what I mean by you look at the organizational procedures and you try to challenge them. They're usually very taken for granted. They evolved when the workforce was much more homogeneous, and people no longer think about them or challenge them. So let me give you an example from our own work. This was an R&D consulting firm, and they were concerned about getting women up into management. They employed scientists, many of them were PhDs, and I think their intent to try to get women up was very serious. They really meant it. So we began to look at, just as the learning from diversity, we began to look at the process by which people got promoted in that firm. And it turns out that what they had were brainstorming meetings. They selected some people to come, top management, all male, selected some people to come to brainstorming meetings, and then they observed the people, and on the basis of what they observed, they decided who they thought would be very good at getting promoted. So then the next question was, how do people get selected to go into these brainstorming meetings? And it turns out that top management, which was not only all male, but was also very concentrated in one or two functions, top management sat around and said, well, who do you know who's good? And of course, as you can imagine, who they knew who was good were people like them, were men in their own functions. Now, once you say it, it seems so obvious. But the fact was that they had been doing this for such a long time, it seemed to be working, it never occurred to them that it was going against their very intent to have more women move up. So they were quite surprised. And what they did, in fact, is interesting. They appointed, in a rotating basis, one of their team to be a devil's advocate and to specifically go through the functions and all the women and to make sure that people got selected into these brainstorming meetings in a more systematic way. And of course, it helped them because they got a more diverse group of people moving up. Not only they finally managed to get the women moving up, but also that they got people from other functions, and so it was sort of a win for everything. So that's really the essence of the work we did in these research projects. We tried to look at the basic assumptions and the procedures and practices that flowed from them and challenged them to see if, in what way they were disadvantaging women, and then try to change them. And the interesting thing was that after the fact, it all seemed really quite obvious. So some of you sent in some questions and asked if I was at all optimistic, if things had happened the way that people thought that maybe it should be happening. So in a way, I think people are not yet challenging the actual way that work is accomplished. Some of you in this room are indeed doing that, and that's a sign for optimism. And I was intrigued by something I heard on the radio. Maybe some of you know it better, but there was a story about Fidelity. Fidelity evidently runs its funds by having one person in charge. You know, we've all heard of Peter Lynch, with all the power. And they ran into a problem, allegations of sexual misconduct, and somebody had to resign. But what they evidently did was, he resigned and that was that. But they rethought the way they run these funds. Instead of leaving that one very powerful person, then the awareness that power is behind some of these allegations, they decided they're going to try to make teams do investment decisions and sort of spread the power around. And that's really the right way to think about it. What are your procedures that are creating some of the difficulties, and how can they be changed? And I think also I have some optimism because we know there are some law firms that have created a different kind of workplace where billable hours is much lower. Sometimes it isn't even billable hours, it's more contractual. It's usually niche firms, and of course it may not be fully scalable because these lifestyle law firms tend to take people from established law firms who have trained them and don't have the training. But still, I think that's a positive sign. There's certainly a change in family roles. Men are becoming much more involved. In fact, some recent research showed that men now have more work-family conflict than women do. Millennial attitudes, seem to be changing somewhat. And there's lots more emphasis on fathers and the role of fathers in parenting. So I think that there is some roles for optimism, even though I'm not sure that people are challenging or thinking about the way they do things in quite the way I would have wanted. So I hope we can have more conversation on that, but I'd like to also tell you a little bit about the retirement study that I'm now involved with. This is being run out of the Harvard Business School, Teresa Amabile, and a few of us retired and retiring professors joined the group and are studying this. We have interviews with people in 3 companies, very different industries, very different geographical location, different age. And we interviewed people employed, both old and young. We interviewed people who were retired from that company, and have a small group of people we're following from before they retired until a year and a half or 2 years afterwards. And the analysis is only beginning, so I can tell you just the impressions that we have on what we're finding. I think one of the things that's interesting is that when people are employed, I don't think, I certainly wasn't, that they're aware of how much their employment structures their life. It structures it by time, structures it by space, it presents a set of relationships that you can have, and when you retire, all of a sudden, that's gone. So we tend to think of this as retirement is a process from external structure to internal agency. And there are now really guides or models of how to deal with this some loss. Not everybody sees it a loss, but certainly that structure is gone. So what we find typically is that at the beginning, there's sort of a relief. There's a relief from pressure. Some people weren't even aware they had the pressure, but there's a relief, no commute, no deadlines. But then the need for some structure begins to play itself up. And people are always worried about, I'm not going to be someone in my pajamas who watches television all day. So they want to be sure. And how do they seem to do it? One thing is there's a transfer of skills. So when they think about what they enjoyed about their work, the skills that they have, can they be transferred? And sometimes we had an engineer who loved to make things. So when he retired, he started making things for his friends and family. And then he even decided he's going to name his little effort, give it a name. He made himself some business cards, and he felt very good because now when people asked him what he did, he could say that he transferred those skills. Other people transferred to volunteering with nonprofits. So that transfer to either friends or family or volunteer is one way we found that people dealt with it. Sometimes they actually took a part-time job or continued contracting with their companies. But the essence always was they wanted to have control over their time. That was the key issue. So they did it in a different way. Some people had developed latent identities, things that they wanted to do. They wanted to write, they wanted to paint. We had someone who wanted to be a screenwriter, had already done a little bit of this, couldn't do it when employed, and after he retired, he did sit down and start screenwriting. Then when I saw him the last time, about a year and a half after he retired, he made this wonderful remark. He said, "Retirement is the time when you can do the things you never had time for before." And then he paused and he said, "But then maybe you don't want to do them anymore." And of course, there are things like travel and moving that help bridge that working to non-working transition. Relationships, I think, are a little bit more complicated. What we found is that even though people say, "I'm going to stay in touch with the people I've been working with," on the whole, those don't last. It's as if the work itself was what held those relationships together, even when they said there was a personal relationship. But what some did from one of the companies, they got together with the retired people from that company, and they sort of formed alumni circles. So it had that work connection, but that barrier between when you're not working and the other person is working, that relationship is harder to keep up. But the alumni, you know, they'd meet once a month, that seemed to work pretty well. Other kinds, of course, family often evolved more time with family, and a number of people started making contact with old friends, maybe in other parts of the country, which they really hadn't had time to keep up before. And also some people took volunteer assignments or sought volunteer assignments that had nothing to do with their particular skills, but provided them with a set of new relationships. And, but all of this, in some cases, it's just the activities that they had previously sandwiched into late at night or weekends expanded. And it might be house project, it might be reading a book, which they never had time for. And so, as a matter of fact, a couple of people said that with their expanded activities and with some new activities, they were so busy that they wondered, how did they ever have time to work, you know? And so, as I say, we're just beginning to do the full analysis, but there's one area that most people didn't think of, which is until it actually happened, and that's the change in the structure of the household. You know, it's in sickness and health, but not for lunch. It's that phenomenon. And that can be a complicated thing for some people, particularly if, you know, sometimes when people retire at the same time, there's this, you know, not for lunch, the 24/7, how do you deal with that? We had one man who retired, his wife was still working, so he decided he's going to make her breakfast. She didn't want him to make breakfast. She had gotten used to that he would leave early and she would have breakfast was her private time, and he was encroaching. So the issues of how to reallocate tasks. We have one woman we've been following who, once she retired, took on more of the household. They had been very egalitarian in household tasks, took on more of the household tasks, and is now getting very nervous that when her husband retires in a few years, is she going to be able to give those back to him? Or will he expect? And so there are, but this notion that we had one person who had been traveling 4 days a week for his whole working time, had been home at weekends, and didn't even know what his wife was doing during the week. And when he retired, well, first they moved and they did things, so it didn't, and he did take some contract work, so he had a little bit of bridging because he loved his work. And took that, and then wondered whether, is it because of the schedule we've had for so many years that we don't know how different we really are? Are we really going to get together in this new world where we are more with each other? And was working on this very hard, and I think it's working out pretty well. So we're now thinking about, and on this notion of identity bridging. You know, how do people, what do they do with their work identity once work isn't there? And so far we've got sort of two things that seem to be happening. Some people, it's a notion of their work identity just lingers. You know, it's still part of that, if only to say, I used to work for GE. You know, it could be an organizational identity. And a few other people who were very involved with their work just absolutely closed it off. We're almost thinking it's almost like an identity closure. It was just gone. And this is not what we had expected. We thought that those people might have the most difficulty in retirement. So we're trying to figure those things out. So I think I'm going to stop and hear, you know, any questions or comments or your own experience on either one of these two topics. Would love to start it off. Yes?
I have just a comment. I think, first of all, we should stop using the word retirement. I think we should call it something else, because retirement have a connotation. Words have a connotation. They have a meaning. Transition. Maybe a third life. Maybe your
Absolutely.
Maybe the first life is your youth when you go to school and learn. Your second life is that what you go to working, and the third is.
And there is a whole, Peter Laslett in England has written a book called The Third Age, talking exactly about that. Phyllis Moyne has written on encore adulthood, you know. So there are many other words that can be used. And as a matter of fact, at the beginning, we shied away from the term. We talked about cessation of full employment. And that got a little bit cumbersome. And it's interesting, we have a word association test. People on the whole associate fairly well with retirement, you know. They may say, but when you say retiree, it's all negative, because it has these associations.
I think that both of the whole issue of work balance and the retirement versus working is that we look at I think that in this country, people look at their lives in silos. I'm in the silo of working person. I'm in the silo of student. I think we got to start more holistically looking at our lives and keep the balance, whether or not we are 20 or 30 or 80, sort of have a more of a
multiple domains that we all live in.
One may be bigger at certain stages in life.
And that's what we would like on the other side, organizations to be aware that their employees are in multiple domains and that those other non-work domains can be useful to the organizations because you learn skills in the community. You learn skills in bringing up children that organizations would really like, but they don't give you either the chance to develop them or an easy way to bring them into the organization.
Question. So, seems like the retirements. Thank you. Seems like that the retirement study focuses more on people who are affluent and who are retiring. Affluent, who have done pretty well in their lives and they've made decent amount of financial wealth and so on and so forth. Did you get a chance to look at people who have probably made 30, 40, 50,000 a year on their lives and what's happened to them when they retire and they can't work?
We didn't. And as a matter of fact, I forgot to say that we were interested in the subjective, the psychological, as the experience of retirement. So we pre-selected our people. We had a little pre-survey who were fairly secure financially and fairly okay with health, because health and wealth overruns everything. So we did not look, and so it was mainly a managerial professional workforce. And that, of course, is a key issue because so many of the people that you're talking about can't afford to retire. And this is not necessarily getting better with US policies. Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you, Professor Bailyn. So I'm of a certain age where, and I'm still very much working. Can you comment on where we are in terms of forced retirement in this country and how it is perceived? 65 was a retirement age 50 years ago, and obviously longevity and mental acuity has changed dramatically in those years, and yet there seems to be some kind of a stasis in terms of mandatory retirement age. How do you see that evolving, and are people apt to stay longer, and are companies more open to extended retirement age?
Of course, it isn't really mandatory anymore. I mean, the law says, you can't, except with few exceptions, you can't force people. But you're absolutely right that there's sort of norms that evolve. One of the things we found in our study is that the organizations don't know how to deal with their older people. People kept saying, look, I have lots of value. Nobody talks, they talk to you about your finances, your health benefits, but they don't talk to you about how can we use your knowledge and your wisdom. There's some companies have a real phased retirement and that's very positive for people, particularly in the initial times. So companies could do much more with that. The other thing we found is that people tend not to want to tell their bosses or anyone about that they're about to retire, because all of a sudden they lose all value. They say, I'm yesterday's person. Now that's also an organization could deal better with. And we had one company which had a phased retirement which seemed to work pretty well. But the fact, people really resented the fact that no one talked to them, not even about succession to their jobs. You know, some people were very concerned. They had a lot of knowledge. They wanted to make sure somebody else was going to take it over, right? And there wasn't even very good succession planning, which also meant that people wouldn't say, our younger people say, oh, I'm going to tell the companies very soon so we can plan for the succession. But when you get there, you know, our older people don't say that because they're worried. So there's lots of room for organizations to do much better. And there is now this aging in work phenomenon, which I think is economically driven, trying to keep people working longer. It saves on Social Security. And our people, on the whole, didn't want to do that in the old conditions. They, I think, would have been open to it if they had control over the time, over when and where. So there is now, within organizations, some effort to provide either post-retirement or phased retirement, contract jobs, you know, contracting with the organization after you're formally retired. That seems to be working to some extent. But the real use of their older people could use a lot of work. MIT has I was a post-retirement for 8 years teaching one seminar and enjoyed it tremendously. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. For your study, I would wonder how much time prior to retirement did the people actually work in the firm? One thing I consider is today you work at a firm maybe 3 years and you depart. So those days of 10 years, 15 years in one firm is, well, I now need to question it. What happens?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This may be the last generation, but most of our people had been with their organizations for a long time. Many for their whole career. Some had gotten into the organization through acquisitions. You know, they had been acquired, but essentially stayed with, and that's no longer happening. So when we talk to our younger people, they're worried about Social Security, you know, whether it's going to be there for them, but they also are aware that they're probably not going to be with their companies. So we don't really know. We have a few people who were there only a short time, but most of our people were these long career people. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. The first question has to do with your previous study. When you investigated how women were managed within the system, did you get any insights about other cultural differences, like people of color, African Americans, Asian Americans, whatever, and how those cultural differences affected their mobility as well? And then as far as the retirement information, can you talk about the industries that these people are working in? Because it's very different for education or nonprofits.
Yeah. So on the first question, we had, unfortunately, very few people of color. We had some, and you know, there's some research that shows that people coming from different cultural, so that men, for example, African American men, who have all this experience in their communities, professional African American men, who have all this experience in their communities and of leading and so, that organizations aren't really capturing that in some way. So, but we ourselves had so little, so little diversity in what we saw that we really don't have much. On the industries, we had one design company located on the West Coast. We had one high-tech company located on the East Coast. and we had one manufacturing company located in the Midwest. And we have not seen very many differences. But we haven't looked at it very systematically. But the experiences seem to be quite similar. And these are, most of the people we had retired in their 60s, so that gets back to the 65 norm. Yeah.
Hi. I would first of all like to thank you, Lotte. As a former student of Lotte Bailyn, I was honored to study under you for my PhD, and thank you so much for all that you taught all of us. Thank you. I have a question actually related to the first study you mentioned, where it seemed as if the informal mechanisms were the ones that were being helpful to people for advancement. And I would just like to ask for your impressions of how those informal mechanisms are still operating. I'm now on the faculty at Boston University, and I've noticed this, and we chatted just very briefly before the event, but I've noticed that there can be this real disconnect between seemingly extremely male and female family-friendly policies and still what people's actual perceptions and practices are. So it's kind of a big question, but I'm just wondering about the persistence of informal mechanisms and the disconnect from the formal policy.
Yeah. It's very true that, I mean, you have a lot of policies, and yet the informal norms may be such. We find that men find it very difficult to take advantage of the flexibility policies. They're seen, you know, sort of as wimps. Now, a little bit, I hope that's changing, because we have more men who are in the families. You know, some are house husbands, and it's the woman who has, you know, there's beginning to be some of that, and there's more work on fathers. But the informal norms are critical, you know, and that's, you know, you have managers who say, look, I know you have a family, you can do anything you want, take any time, but if that manager is there, you know, for 24 hours and sends you a text message at any time, it's not going to help what he says. You know, you're going to. So in our work, we tried very hard to look at the norms, at the, you know, as well as the actual practices that we could observe. Give you an example. My colleague Joyce Fletcher, who was on one of our teams when we were working, she followed women engineers and tried to see how they did their work. And she discovered that they did, she calls it relational practices. They tried to prevent problems instead of being the hero who comes in, solves a problem even though he, you know, made it himself. They work more in teams. They work to teach people how to do things instead of telling them. But what happened was that this was not seen as competence. The informal norms around gender, it was seen as these are women trying to be nice, they want to be liked. So even though the motivation was to get the work done better. So you have to surface those informal norms. So for example, the norm in the company that I gave the example of, there was a norm that since, you know, doing the science was seen as the most important thing, nobody's supposed to ask for, can't I be promoted, even though promotion brought more status, more control over the decisions of the company and more money. You weren't supposed to ask. And so there was this norm that, and also a norm that anyway, it's clearly a meritocracy, and my work will just show, you know, I don't have to do it. And you have to get at those. And so we tried very hard to get at some of these norms as well as the practices that ranged from them.
Organizations, there are these women's networks and affinity groups, and they're very active in the organization.
Say it again?
So in several organizations, they have these women networks and similar affinity groups, which are very active. They meet regularly. They have agendas. But more often than not, the changes which they're able to accomplish are more rhetoric than substantive.
Are more what?
They're not as substantive as, at least at a policy level, as you would want them to be. So I'm just curious if that's been your, impression of women's networks as well, and if you've seen one where significant change was accomplished, and what did that network do differently?
I think you bring up a very important point, which may be network or maybe even within a working group or something. I don't think individuals can really do much on their own. So I think it is from inside an organization, it needs to be a collective effort, whether it's all women, whether it's an identity group, or whether it's a particular work group or something. And there have been, the MIT example is an interesting example, when the women in the Faculty of Science got together and wrote this report, and the president acknowledged that there had been troubles. There have been a lot of changes at MIT. There are many more women now. That isn't to say that everything has been solved, because, there are still these gender stereotypes which lead to biases without intent. So, you don't need to call it discrimination. Usually you feel there's an intent, but there can be biases without intent. But in these networks, I think, have helped people to make changes, and sometimes they're important enough to make a difference, and other times they're not. Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to read the microphone. Excellent. Hi, thank you. I'm very interested in both topics. I wanted to make a quick comment and then ask a question. Just in my business and businesses of people I know, I've seen people take really clever advantage of people that don't want to work full time. I have employees in London, in the hills, in Colorado, up in the mountains, who don't want to be in the city or don't want to commute many hours. And I find those people, all of their work hours are very productive. I think that nobody can really deliver more than 40-ish truly productive, focused work hours. And so I'm thrilled with my experience using contractors, and people who are thrilled to have the opportunity for the contract work. So that's sort of, I think that's a continuum, that's sort of a retirement thing, but it goes all the way back, and it creates options for people who want more work-life balance. The thing that, when I think about the sort of this women professional promotion, success, leadership issue, and why aren't more women succeeding, and why aren't more women in leadership positions, I feel, my experience is that it really does come down to the networks, but not just the networks, the bias. And I think it's not a male-female thing. A lot of people think it's a men versus women. It's like society against women. And I think that the gender bias is so huge, and there's lots of great examples, and I feel like there's so little awareness. It's death by 1,000 cuts. If you tell somebody, oh, well, we were all communicating on email and those guys decided to go out for a beer and didn't invite me, people say, like that's just one little cut. If you say that I wasn't invited to this, or I wasn't considered for that, or, there's so many little teeny things that impact women's advancement. And I just wonder, and there seems to be so little awareness of it. Is there a move towards more understanding and awareness? And I did a little bit of personal research comparing racial bias to gender bias. And with half the world population being women, it seems like there's so little awareness. And I just wonder why that is.
Well, I think in some ways there is awareness. And it's interesting because the problem with these little things is what is now called cumulative disadvantage. I mean, they add up, certainly in the experience, and it relates to self-esteem and the feeling of comfort. But it's interesting because in discussing these plans of bringing out a book or a film on the MIT report, this is very much they want to start a Metoo movement on this kind of unconscious, making it clear that, you know, it's easy for men to say that this is trivial, don't worry, you know, it really means nothing. But for women anyway, there is this issue that femininity and professionalism don't go together in quite the same way as masculinity and professionalism. So it's important for women to protect their professionalism, and these little biases pull back on the femininity instead of honoring the professionalism. And that's a problem that you're absolutely right, it's a social problem, it's the society. It's a problem that men don't face, because for them, the professionalism and the gender identity go together. And that's why it's hard for men to understand the effect of these small little things which in themselves are trivial, but accumulate. And one of the things that we hope to do is to bring these things, and, you know, because you're absolutely right, but it's a societal, it's not only in any one organization. Jody, did you?
I do, and yeah, it's hard to beat that one. That's really profound. But I'm also one of Lottie's grateful former students, and I was very inspired by your work with Joyce in particular on these interventions that you've done, and have it's helped me take what it was a fairly linear model of organizational performance and turn it into a relational model of change. In the following way, you mentioned that, and I think we've reiterated in several ways, that formal policies aren't enough. There's some kind of culture change that makes those formal policies either irrelevant or highly relevant. They've got to be aligned. And so we've developed this model where there are structural interventions, which were always there in the model, and this is really about broader interprofessional change and not just about gender, but I think it's very aligned. And in addition to that, talking about the need to start with relational interventions, where you're actually making visible in safe spaces where you can see both those who are higher in the power hierarchy and lower, what is actually, make it visible and make it discussable, so that some of these invisible hurts that you're mentioning, they're not even seen by those who are carrying them out, probably because it looks like, oh, it's so trivial. But making that visible through relational mapping and so on, and to see the perceptions of respect in different directions, and you can, so people, the practitioners who are taking up this work are much more advanced in this than I am as a theorist who is really just trying to understand what they're doing. But to start that culture change, sometimes humble inquiry is a big part of it, and teaching people to engage in that. And as that culture changes, then the structures just kind of flow out of that, okay, this is what we want now. So they're not just formal policies being kind of placed there because we're supposed to do it, but the structures and policies are really growing out of the people who now see what's there and what we want to be there. And so I just wondered how that I thought we were inspired by your work, but how did that fit with the interventions that you were carrying out I know one was in a community health center, but they're in different places, where it seemed that you were starting with the relational kind of interventions, and then as people started to build those, then they were starting to create structures to help maybe balance work and family, for example.
Yeah. I have a sense, thinking back on our interventions, we tended, I think, more to have more structural interventions. And the relationship, I should say that Jodi's work has been wonderful, and any of you who don't know it should look it up on relational coordination. But I think obviously they go together, and it's like, you know, behavior and attitudes, which changes first. You can change the behavior and the attitudes follow, or do you work on the attitudes and hope the behavior? I think ours has been more starting with some structural changes. But I'm reminded from what you say that Ed Chine is just bringing out with his son his book on humble leadership. And he's very much geared to the relational. So he has these levels of relationships where level 1 is very transactional, you know, it's your role that determines and level 2 is you sort of know the whole person. You build a relationship with that person. These are work relationships. You don't necessarily have to like them or be very close to them, but you build a relationship. And then level 3 is the sort of intimate friend kind of thing. And the whole basis of that book is that organizations have to get to level 2. You know, so he's really starting very much on that relational level. Yeah, Ed.
I'll wait for the mic.
Yes.
Lotte, I have two short, very different questions that may allow you to broaden the base. First, given all the discussion today about sexual harassment, have there been any studies that link the degree of sexual harassment in an organization to gender bias? And the second question, totally different, is there are wonderful organizations like care.com that worry about how one takes care of parents or children. Are there any organizations that focus on how one takes care of the process of retiring?
No, we see, let me start with the second, and then you'll remind me on the first. That's what's not been happening. Look, we have these 3 organizations, and the people are complaining that they are not getting any help in some of the issues, except for, you know, what their benefits will be and what they need to do with their financial, with their pension or whatever it is. They are not getting any help on what this all means. Now, one of our organizations, interestingly enough, one of the people who was retired but was working on the last job she had before she retired, and she was almost there from the beginning, this is a relatively young organization, she was working on retirement. And she realized that this was not happening. And by chance, I read one of the interviews of our young people in that organization who said, we're getting already some help on retirement. So it's possible that her effort is going to permeate that organization. But the other 2 larger organizations, we saw nothing of it. And it's a real opportunity for people. We're hoping, in a way, that maybe the results of our study, you know, we've given feedback to these organizations and explained this lack and how they're not using their pre-retirement people intelligently, and that there are phase downs and connection and help with this process that would help them as well as help the employees. So then on the second, the connection with sexual harassment, and it's the same thing. I mean, I don't know if there are specific studies, but it's all based on these power differentials. And that's what's interesting about the Metoo, and we use it sort of as a template, perhaps, for a Metoo on this unconscious bias and the effects of the accumulation of these disadvantages. What?
This will be the last question.
Last question?
Yes.
Last question, I'm told. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.
Professor Bailyn, I wanted to say also thank you very much for the focus that you have had through your career. I came to Sloan as an MBA student with an interest specifically in how do we make people's work lives better. And that is what you've worked on. And I saw through taking class with you and a seminar with you that through work-life balance, there's a possibility of considering reorganizing work, and you really tried to make those sorts of things happen. And one of the questions that I have for you now that years have passed is about your career spiral idea. And I'm curious to know what you think looking back on that idea. How did organizations react to the notion of a career spiral? Would you adapt that theory and concept now in a different way? And have you seen anybody adopt the idea? Just what are your thoughts on that whole notion?
Yeah. No, not really. I think there is something to be said, and it goes back a little bit to the using subcontract, people who don't want to work full-time, to think of a career and think of a life, if you will, in much less linear terms. We talked about there's education, there's work, there's retirement, these three ages. I don't think that's going to work anymore. So I think even within the employment years, I think it would be very helpful if there could be periods of less involvement and less commitment, followed by periods of more commitment, and that this could be seen as legitimate because people's personal lives also, have periods when it needs more commitment. I mean, the crazy thing about the way careers are seen at the moment is that those early years are the high demand years both for work and for family, and that's crazy. So how to bring that about and how not to have those, quote, less involved careers then carry on, therefore you're not committed, therefore you're not a good worker, the realization that people will work much better if it meshes well with their interests and responsibilities outside of work. I mean, it's the total separation of the work and family spheres in the minds of organizations and the practices they've evolved, and even in people's minds that creates some of the problems. And I would hope that people would see how intersecting these and bringing them together by change in family roles, by change in organizational practices would benefit everyone, not only the people who are working, but would also benefit the business, because they get people when they are ready to be most productive. But do I see it? I'm not sure.
Weren't we all just so lucky to be here? How wonderful. Thank you, Lotte. This was truly, truly a wonderful, wonderful lunch that we had with you, and a lot of learning also. So thank you all for coming. This was great that you were here to learn and listen and share. And please enjoy yourselves with the connections that you made. And you know that MIT is doing the International Women's Day conference on March 9th, which is coming up soon. And Sloan is going to be showcasing some of our women alums. So if you're online and looking at the social networking, you'll see some of your classmates there. So thank you all very much again. Terrific.